So can you just raise your hand when
Yes.
you're ready to go? Just raise your hand when it's ready to go.
We're live, we're good.
Okay, well, good morning. This is Akshay Mathur. I'm with Gateway House. Welcome to the Google Hangout series that we've been doing on India's foreign policy agenda. As you know, at Gateway House, about a month ago, before the new government was sworn in, we did a series of Google Hangouts, starting from all the way from what India's foreign policy agenda should be for the Indo-Pacific, then coming to ASEAN, also looking at Latin America, Africa, Europe, and the United States. Today we're going to discuss South Asia as well as China. And we have with us two people as our panelists. First, of course, is Ambassador Neelam. He's the co-founder and director of Gateway House. So Neelam, thank you for doing this Google Hangout. And also joining, sorry.
Well, I'm really pleased to be on.
And also joining us from the US is Prashant. Prashant is a scholar associated with Center for Strategic International Studies, as well as the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston. So thank you for joining us, Prashant.
Thanks for having me.
As you know, one of Prime Minister Modi's first policy steps was to invite all the South Asian leaders for his swearing-in ceremony. That was his first public policy move. His first public policy move was actually a foreign policy move. So clearly, foreign policy is high on his agenda. And since then, not only has he made other positive foreign policy moves, but he's also surprised the strategic community and the international community with how swiftly he has been moving with his in closing in on his international calendar. So there are now confirmed reports that his first trip may actually be to Bhutan, which is a really interesting move. So I'd like to pose that question to you, Neelam, to you first. Why Bhutan?
Well, Bhutan, I guess the answer really in some ways is why not Bhutan. Bhutan is one of the least controversial countries in the world. It has no quarrels with anybody. It has come forth with anodyne-sounding proposals like the Gross Happiness Index instead of the Gross National Product as a measure of welfare, but not simplistic, because it's a measure of welfare, its intent is also to influence policies that governments would undertake, which would increase welfare without damaging the environment. But for India, Bhutan is of course a member of SAARC. It's one of our immediate and land neighbors. It has been one of the friendliest countries, consistently supporting India in the United Nations and other international forums in which it plays a quite significant part despite its small size. It's also important as a bilateral relationship in the hope that our other neighbors with whom there are more elements in the relationship, some of them contentious, will also see that it can be a very productive relationship, especially in the economic area. Bhutan, really speaking, was one of the poorest countries in the world, but because it has moved proactively to develop its hydroelectric potential with Indian inputs, with Indian investment, it is now one of the better off countries within SAARC, and its people actually enjoy a higher standard of living than some of our other neighbors, as well as people in many parts of India itself. But it's also very strategically located between India and China. Therefore, a first goodwill visit to Bhutan is a message to all our neighbors, and we of course have a long border with China, so it's also one of our land neighbors.
Prashant, on the other hand, of all the foreign visits that could have been made by various countries, Chinese government made the first foreign visit to India. The Chinese foreign minister was here. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really interesting and perhaps a smart move by the Chinese because I think it really puts them out in front of Modi's foreign policy agenda because he was headed, I think he's going to be headed to Japan in July, and then he's going to be headed in the U.S. to the U.S. in September, and he's going to be headed to China by the end of the year. So the Chinese are sort of getting in the front of that before he heads out to U.S. and Japan. And U.S., Japan, and India have been talking about a trilateral dialogue for a long time. And the Chinese have their own problems in some of their other borders with Southeast Asian countries and Northeast Asian countries, particularly Japan. So I think they're very keen to keep at least their western flank not as problematic, so they are not, essentially surrounded by problems on all sides. So I think it was a very smart move. Although I think it remains to be seen whether they'll actually deliver on some of the rhetoric that they've stated. There's been some rhetoric around the border cooperation agreement and resolving some of the disputes, and those are obviously very contentious.
But Prashant, you also realize that Prime Minister Modi and India in general has had a very deep relationship with Japan for the last 5 to 10 years. And Prime Minister Modi is likely to visit Japan first before he visits China. Mm-hmm. How will the relationship with Japan be perceived by China?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chinese sort of already sense that there's this, as part of the U.S. pivot or rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, the United States is trying to form greater links with its alliance partners and between its alliance partners and also emerging partners or emerging countries. So India, Japan, Australia, they've all been seen by the Chinese as part of this network of U.S. Allies and partners that sort of essentially surround China. So I think the Chinese have already perceived that India and Japan are part of this framework, but I think what they're trying to do is basically say, wait a minute, this positioning is not preordained, and contentious relations with India and China are not necessarily something that is to be assumed. And because there's a new leadership, there's an opportunity for them to work together. Because I think the Chinese have come out publicly, in fact, and stated that they feel very contained by the U.S. Rebalance or the U.S. pivot.
Neelam, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, I suppose by inviting all the South Asian leaders and by making the first visit to Bhutan, like you said, the Prime Minister has reminded and confirmed that neighborhood is the most important region for India to focus on. But given some of the developments in Pakistan, especially with respect to the collapsing security situation, and especially with respect to the attacks that have happened over the last few days, what can India do? What can Prime Minister Modi do to advance our own interests in relationship with Pakistan? Is there a step that can be taken by us? Is there an agenda that we can put forward for the government, for the new government?
Before I get to Pakistan, I just want to say that India and Japan have a relationship much longer than whether it is seen by the United States as somehow fitting into their pivot or by the Chinese as somehow part of trying to contain them. India was one of the only countries which befriended Japan immediately after the Second World War. And there are good memories of it, even if they are not always at the top of people's minds. But in the establishment in Japan, China knows that perfectly well. And China is itself in close relations with countries with which India has a more contentious situation. So I think it will not necessarily be perceived as some kind of particularly hostile anti-Chinese move, as the relationship with Japan, which is India's largest aid giver already, as that relationship develops. But to come to Pakistan, of course, Pakistan is going through one of its worst phases with, 2 consecutive attacks on Karachi airport. These attacks have been preceded by numerous other attacks in Karachi itself, including and especially in defense installations, the naval base, all kinds of other really significant targets. At the same time, I think it must worry everybody what is happening with amazing speed in Iraq, where the ISIS is actually taking over whole towns. I mean, to have occupied the second largest city in Iraq in 3 days, that's shocking, and it has to be shocking to the establishment in Pakistan as well. In terms of allowing the terrorist groups of various kinds free run in the country, because it has been their traditional policy to use some of them against India. I think that the popular mood in Pakistan has changed. People want a productive relationship with India, at least a productive economic relationship with India. You see that reflected in the press. You see that reflected in the comments of analysts. And it was most visible in the remarks that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif himself made. So in some senses, the rest of Pakistani society is actually diverging from whatever are the objectives of intelligence agencies and even maybe the army in Pakistan. But Pakistan simply cannot continue with its head buried in the sand on how grave the terrorist threat is to that society. It really has to make choices. It has to pull itself together, and not least for the impact on India, but mostly for the impact on itself. In terms of what India can do, I don't think that other countries can do very much when a society and a polity is disintegrating in the way as we see in Pakistan. I mean, in the United States, for instance, they have reopened the attacks on each other, on whose fault it was that Iraq is where it is. It is well for neighbors and faraway countries not to intervene in countries' internal affairs, and it is greatly to the credit of the Indian governments, past and we hope in the future as well, that they have acted with restraint with reference to neighbors instead of trying to jump in and aggravate the problems. India should stay out. We should never try to take advantage of problems in Pakistan. We should be supportive in our statements. But this is so serious an issue that it is for Pakistan to address its existential threats.
Prashant, I'd like to take you back on our eastern flank. We have other countries in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Vietnam, that are also have growing concerns over China's reach in the region, and these are also countries with which India has deep relationships. How do you see how would you like to see India's relationships with ASEAN develop, given the geopolitical tensions that are currently there in the South China Sea? Because it is an important region of trade and finance for us, and of course also now oil and energy. Energy especially generally. How do you see that developing, and what would be some of the steps that the Indian government can take, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the least controversial place to start would be in terms of economics and trade. So boosting, greater links with Myanmar, for example, trying to get better diplomatic and economic ties with some of the other Southeast Asian countries as well, because I think there's great agreement within all the countries in Southeast Asia about the need to engage with India economically, and sort of creating a broader sort of Asian linkage in terms of trade and infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. I think where you get into the more sort of, I guess, controversial dimension is when you get to security ties, because, for example, if you're talking about India and Vietnam, and you're talking about sort of joint links in terms of potential exploitation of natural resources, then, if you're talking about it in this environment, and if those two countries were to try to pursue it, this would be really a something that would be very controversial, because the Chinese are, given what the Chinese are doing in Vietnam, that would be a little bit sort of a hot potato. But I think it seems like, based on Modi's own inclinations, that he's mainly focused primarily on economics first. And I think in that regard, if that's what he's planning on doing, Southeast Asian countries will not disagree with that, because when you go to every single Southeast Asian country, they'll say they like to engage economically with every single country, not just the United States, not just China, not just India or Japan, but everybody. And the more the merrier.
As India should also, perhaps, but sometimes we are also now constantly getting reminded that there are limitations to economics and trade, and even though China and Japan have $500 billion of trade with each other, there still seems to be considerable tension between the two countries. But therein lies my second question, or a follow-up question to you. You've studied China, you've looked at East Asia in general, and you've looked at India. How do you see some of these multilateral forums developing? The East Asia Summit, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We recently had the CICA, which was the Confidence Building Measures Summit. Some of these summits are taking place, and RCEP, which is the Economic Partnership Agreement, sort of like a counter to the Transatlantic and Trans-Pacific Treaty. The RCEP stands for Regional Economic Partnership, Comprehensive Economic Partnership. How do you see India and China playing in these forums, especially because China and India both give a lot of value to multilateral forums? They give precedence to it, they give preference to it.
Yeah, I mean, I see multilateral forums, and I'm talking about the ones that you refer to, like the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and these other institutions, rather than institutions like the ADMM Plus, for example, which is a little bit more forward-leaning. I think these other institutions, the Chinese at least, have made it a point to say that this is not the place where you address very controversial issues. These are places where you talk about issues that everybody can agree on. We agree on sort of confidence-building measures. We talk about issues sometimes at the leaders level, sometimes at lower levels. But any controversies should be left to be addressed either bilaterally or in other forums. So I think in that regard, there's actually a lot of potential for synergy in these multilateral forums among not just India and China, but also other countries in Southeast Asia and beyond. I think where you'll see a lot of more of the tensions play out is on a bilateral basis, because as you know, some of these institutions are ASEAN-led, and ASEAN is very conscious about preserving what it calls its centrality in some of these mechanisms. So if an individual country, it doesn't matter what country it is, if it's the U.S., if it's China, any other country tries to hijack a multilateral institution to pursue its own agenda or to make it seem divisive, ASEAN countries would find that sort of not very conducive to their role as being sort of the central power brokers in the Asia Pacific.
Suppose, Neelam, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say that yes, I think that is the Chinese agenda, that we do economic, and the Chinese pursue their strategic objectives bilaterally, making sure that the weaker party on the other side is blackmailed by the percentages of trade and investment. It's been seen most clearly perhaps with the Philippines, and it's kind of, that strategy is reaching the limit, because China's strategic objectives are no longer just being discussed. They are being asserted and they are sought to be obtained. So I think that it will be difficult for ASEAN. Certainly preserving its centrality is important, but I think they are going to have to get beyond not issuing a joint statement as they did in Cambodia in 2012. Those options are like empty options. I think China has grown so fast. It has grown in unprecedented, and it has to be confronted in the sense that it has to be dealt with. China is not any longer keeping its head down and doing economic, and it does not even talk about a peaceful rise anymore. In fact, it's very assertive on how it will pursue its undebatable objectives. So I think we're actually going to see a lot of change. Therefore, the economic institutions like RCEP may proceed, but I think even those will rub up against contending sovereignties.
Yeah, just to quickly add on that, I think that that's definitely a valid point. I think you're seeing the Chinese assertiveness also change how these regional institutions look at China and address some of these issues. So you saw ASEAN in their latest summit earlier this year actually issue a separate statement on the South China Sea, something that they haven't done in nearly 2 decades. So that was pretty significant as well. And I think some of the ASEAN countries, particularly some of those that are closer to China, are really wary about the impacts of signing on to something like the RCEP, because that sort of basically gets them even closer to the Chinese orbit. So you see some countries like Vietnam, for example, simultaneously pursuing the RCEP and the TPP as a way to sort of offset some of this dependence on the Chinese. And Myanmar, part of their opening was predicated on being overly dependent on the Chinese as well. So.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you for giving your inputs. We at Gateway House have written a paper called Neighborhood Views of India. It has views of all the SAARC countries, as scholars, analysts, politicians, leaders, journalists, handpicked, and who have written how their own countries view India's foreign policy towards them. We published this last year. It's called Neighborhood Views of India. It's on our website. And this year we are also planning to do a lot more work on China and on East Asia. The articles are all on our website. I appreciate you joining us for this panel discussion. Prashant, special thanks to you for joining us from the US. Hopefully we can have many more sessions and go into some more deeper conversations specifically related to China and Japan and South Korea next. Neelam, as always, much for agreeing to participate, and you will see. Please keep a lookout on our Google Hangout channel for Gateway House. You will see more of such panel discussions coming up in the near future as we help to give suggestions to our own government on what it can do for its foreign policy going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great.